Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to video number 4 in my Axis and Allies 1914 series. This video is Germany's strategic video. Germany is third in turn sequence order to go. Only Austria, Hungary, and Russia have gone in front of Germany. This power is very dynamic, at least in the first turn. There will be fighting on the west front. There is a high probability there will be fighting on the east front. There will be several naval clashes, and finally there are even assets down in Africa. There's enough going on with this power on its first turn that I'm going to break it up into 4 separate segments. First we'll cover what to do on the east front, then we'll cover the naval movements. After that we'll cover what to do on the west front, and finally I'll go over what I think the best moves are to make in Africa. But first let's review what I think is a good first turn purchase for Germany. Germany starts the game with 35 IPCs. My recommended purchase is 9 infantry, 1 fighter, and save 2. As I've already alluded to in earlier videos, infantry are the backbone of this game, and Germany's going to be doing a lot of heavy fighting in the east and west fronts. Germany also starts out with a whopping 22 pieces of artillery, and so like the Austrians, I generally recommend a fighter a turn until you have at least 3 fighters. In order for all of this to flow well and make sense, I need to do all the movement phase activities for the German pieces on mainland Europe. So the very first thing I'm going to do is move 2 pieces from Munich into Tyrolia. This is in direct support of Austria-Hungary's turn, so to understand completely what we're doing here, you'll need to check out the Austria-Hungary strategic video. Next, if the Russian opponent has elected to do the Ukraine defense, we are going to push all our infantry from Prussia and Silesia, as well as the artillery, into Poland. We're also going to bring the German air unit. Next, we're going to move all the units in Berlin to Silesia. Now we're going to send 5 of 6 infantry from Hanover into Silesia. We're going to remove the remaining infantry in Hanover to Munich. The Ruhr and the Alsace are both going to dogpile into Belgium. These units in Munich are all going to move into Alsace. Lastly, we're going to break up this group of infantry here. We're going to send 1 into the Ruhr, 1 into Hanover, and 1 will stay put while the artillery all move to Hanover. Okay, now we'll go ahead and get this all chipped up. Okay, much better. Let's zoom in on the east front and see what's going on here. Before I discuss this push into Poland as Germany, I need to say as a disclaimer that this is going to be an incomplete picture on the overall German strategy out here on the East Front. To fully understand what's going on out here, at least in the first half dozen turns for Germany, I encourage you to check out video number 5 in this series titled The Russian Revolution Rule. This video is going to focus on the G1 opener only. So with that out of the way, let's now discuss why I think Germany moving into Poland, if it can, on its first turn is a good idea. First, let's discuss why it looks like a bad idea. We have only 12 infantry and 6 artillery compared to what the Russians will likely have in the backfield here, which is going to be roughly 30 plus infantry and 10 plus artillery, possibly with an air unit to throw in. And from that perspective, it might seem a little odd that Germany would push Poland. But there are several factors incentivizing Russia not to counterattack Poland on its second turn, and they all have to do with Austria-Hungary. First, since Austria-Hungary goes before Russia, the Austro-Hungary player can simply move troops into Poland to reinforce if they feel a Russian attack is coming. Second, it's not entirely crazy that the Austro-Hungarian player would attack the Ukraine with forces from Romania and Galicia on its second turn. This hypothetical attack into Ukraine would be slightly uphill, that is to say slightly in favor of the Russians by about 3 pieces, but it would have the benefit of freezing this army in place. Lastly, the Austrian player could elect to simply stack all his pieces in Galicia on his second turn. When Russia's second turn comes up, any attack or movement out of Ukraine into Poland pulls troops out of this incredibly crucial territory that is adjacent to Moscow. In other words, if the Russian player did something like a full counterattack into Poland, this now large Austrian army simply moves into Ukraine, which is adjacent to Moscow, and Russia's army is out of place. So that's a way of looking at it through the lens of Austria-Hungary and Russia. As Germany, we are of course looking to add IPCs to our empire, and Poland is worth 3. This also puts us in a position to move in or help out in the next line of Russian territories here. And overall, it puts us closer to Moscow, which is the end goal. So they feel like this is a fairly common and reliable opening move for Germany on its first turn. There is, of course, one other aspect of Russia's setup that we need to cover, and that is the Poland defense. Check out video number 3 in this series if you want to hear more about this, but essentially I'm going to reset the board and look at a situation where Russia has stacked as many troops as it could in Poland in order to blunt Germany's first turn against it. Okay, I've gone ahead and reset the board for the Russian defense of Poland. In this case, there are 21 infantry and 8 artillery in this territory. That is the maximum amount of pieces the Russians could push in there. I alluded to the deficiencies of this defense in the Russia video, but just to very quickly recap, the Austrian armies have an option to move into Ukraine and be adjacent to Moscow. And if the Central Powers player is not comfortable eating this massed counterattack against the Austrian army, which is somewhat in favor of the Russian player, then attacking and freezing the Polish army in place doesn't look like such a terrible idea. This is a rather steeply uphill fight for the German player. They're likely to lose 14 or 15 pieces, and if we move in all 12 infantry, 6 artillery, and the fighter from Berlin, there's still a 7% chance that we lose all of our pieces. Assuming the German player creates a contested zone here, however, the Austro-Hungarians push Ukraine. When they do so, the Russian player will be forced into a very difficult decision of whether to send in the local units to try to create a contested zone here, or to stack up on Moscow and try to defend the capital territory from a turn 3 attack by Austria-Hungary. So I'll just try to cut to the chase here and answer the question, when would you stand down and stack up and do something like this? So here it is. If the Austrian player got hung up in Romania and failed to clear this territory, and then the Russian player decided to do an upfront defense, I would stand down as Germany in that case. Okay, I think that's enough said for the Eastern Front. Let's now move to the battles in the Atlantic. So before I review what I think is the best opener for Germany's Navy, let's first take stock of what we have out here. There are 4 German subs split between 2 sea zones, that's Sea Zone 7 and Sea Zone 5. There's also 2 German cruisers and a battleship in Sea Zone 10. And though the battleship functions very similarly to the battleships in other versions of Axis and Allies, cruisers and submarines are a little bit different. For now, understand that submarines do not have a first strike or surprise strike ability. So with that out of the way, what I think is the best opener for Germany's Navy is probably also the most intuitive one, and that is to attack the British Navy in Sea Zone 9. Now I recommend doing this with the 2 subs from Sea Zone 5 as well as the fleet from Sea Zone 10. I strongly recommend making this attack because I feel like the only other option is to stack up in Sea Zone 10, but I would discourage a Central Powers or German player from doing this. And that's for the simple reason that the situation for the Central Powers doesn't get better. If we're going to do damage, it's going to be now, before the Entente has a chance to consolidate their navies and make it so that attacks in the future are less likely. And with the pair of subs in Sea Zone 7, there's a couple different things you could do. You can support the attack in Sea Zone 9. Of course, this would involve each submarine running through 2 minefields. But my stock move and what I recommend is to attack the British in Sea Zone 2. So let's go ahead and push these pieces and then take a look at the odds. We'll first start with the battle over here in Sea Zone 2. There's no minefield around Canada, so this is pretty straightforward. There's a 77% chance the Germans win this fight with at least 1 boat remaining. So that's it, pretty clean and straightforward. In contrast, the Sea Zone 9 battle can be quite messy. The Germans have to pass through what is probably the most consequential mine roll of the entire game. Each boat must individually roll a mine check to see if it makes it into the sea zone unscathed. And when rolling 5 dice, there's actually a 60% chance that at least 1 1 will be rolled. That's to say that more times than not, the Germans will suffer a casualty entering Sea Zone 9. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the odds for this battle. First, if the Germans were lucky enough to suffer no mine hits, there's a 93% chance they win the battle, a 2% chance of a draw, and a 4% chance of a loss. And in this case, they're very likely to have 3 boats left over. That is, a damaged battleship and 2 cruisers. In the case where the German battleship takes a hit from mines, there's an 82% chance of a win, 5% chance of a draw, and a 13% chance of a loss. And there's essentially an equal probability of 2 or 3 boats surviving in that case. In the case where a German sub is knocked off by mines, there's a 77% chance of a win, a 6% chance of a draw, a 17% chance of a loss, and you're likely to have 2 boats remaining. And finally, in the case where a German cruiser is hit, there is a 71% chance of a win, an 8% chance of a draw, and 21% chance of a loss. And again, in this situation, likely there will be 2 boats left. When it comes to the Germans taking 2 hits, it's now reduced to something in the ballpark of a 50% chance of a win. Taking 3 hits from mines puts the chance of a win down near 30%. As the German player, I would absolutely attack even if I'd suffered 2 mine hits. Suffering 3 or more is an extremely low probability, but it can happen. And in that unhappy case, I would put it to the German player's discretion whether to attack uphill, or as in the case of the Austrian fleet, stand down from fighting in order to at least block the transport from being able to load up in Sea Zone 9. In more games than not, however, the Germans will destroy the British fleet and there will likely be 2 boats remaining. So for purposes of this demonstration, we're going to say that the Germans win both of these battles. In Sea Zone 2, they have 1 German submarine remaining, and in Sea Zone 9, they have 1 damaged German battleship and 1 German cruiser. And with these naval battles resolved to their most likely outcome, we're now going to pan back and take a look at the wider war in the Atlantic. So now that we've taken a step back, let's take a moment and appreciate what the German Navy has likely accomplished here. The British Navy, for the time being, does not exist as a fighting force in the North Atlantic. This means that all the units in Canada and the United Kingdom are stuck in place at least for the first turn. I'm now going to demonstrate what I think is the best mid and long-range goals for Central Powers naval units, and it's going to require that I dabble in the French turn. So the French are going to be looking for every opportunity they can to get more pieces into the fight. And the most intuitive move is to activate Portugal and get as many or all of these troops out of that country and into France, or wherever else they might be needed. This typically means that France is going to load up at least 1 infantry and move into Sea Zone 14 to activate the Portuguese units therein. But after doing that, there's now 5 pieces in Portugal, so there's incentive to get the other 2 transports and push them into Sea Zone 14 as well. At this point, there's at least a few obvious problems the Entente player needs to solve. First and most obvious, this German sub is in range. The Austrian fleet may be problematic from Sea Zone 17. And perhaps most important is any German cruiser that may have survived that's in Sea Zone 9. In fact, more times than not, this becomes the most important piece. And despite how it looks, this is actually a fairly difficult problem for the French player to solve. The French have 2 battleships and a cruiser, and it might seem intuitive to simply pull the entire fleet into Sea Zone 14. And while at first glance this seems like a decent move, thanks to the unique rules of naval movement and combat, whether it comes from Sea Zone 17 or Sea Zone 9, it only takes a single cruiser moving 3 spaces into Sea Zone 14 and declaring that they're not going to engage in combat to create a hostile sea zone and thereby eliminate the ability of these French transports to load those troops out of Portugal on the next turn. Yes, in the example I've shown, this cruiser would have to roll a mine dice in Sea Zone 8, but controlling the board as the Central Powers player in this way is worth the eventual loss of this cruiser. I'll discuss more about what I do with France in the French strategic video. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to know the rules of naval combat in this game. Before I end this segment on the Battle of the Atlantic, by way of a long-range strategy for the Central Powers, there's one other situation that I need to cover. America enters the war at the beginning of its fourth turn. This means that the Central Powers should be looking for any opportunity to move into Sea Zone 1 on turn 4. The USA will still be neutral at the time of doing this, so you won't have to roll for mines. And if there's no Entente ships in range to clear any Central Powers naval units from this sea zone, then the United States will be unable to load its transports and actually start moving towards the fighting. This effectively brings the United States in a turn later. This move as a Central Powers can come up more often than you think. It's a non-intuitive play for either side, and whether you're the Entente or the Central Powers, you're going to be in a better, more competitive position if you know that it exists. This move might come off as gamey, but I feel like the only people who are going to say that are the people who are surprised by it. This situation really only develops when an Entente player fails to respect what the Central Powers can do with just a handful of ships. So whether you end up as the Entente or the Central Powers, look for this opportunity. Let's now move to the West Front. Just a quick recap on what we have going on out here. Everything that started in the Ruhr and Alsace is moving into Belgium to attack the units therein. And though we're making this attack as Germany out on the West Front, the priority is to kill Russia first. This means that after the first turn, Germany's going to be very defensive-minded, probably until turn 4, 5, or even 6. One of the more popular issues that the Germans had to solve in World War I was fighting the dreaded two-front war. And I think 1914 does a stellar job of putting pressure on the German player and recreating this problem. Most of the purchases from Berlin are going to be heading towards the East Front, and I would say in the ballpark of at least 2/3 to 3/4. This will keep on until about turn 4 or 5, or until Russia is out of the game. So a discussion of short and mid-range goals as Germany out on the West Front is one of defense. So the attack into Belgium is a 99% chance, and we're very likely to receive only 2 hits on the return fire. But we're going to say the Belgians shot up, so there are only 11 German infantry remaining. A quick analysis of the French counterattack option here shows that even with 12 infantry, 4 artillery, and air support, it's still an uphill attack for the French. What's most likely to happen on the French turn is a consolidation in Lorraine. From this territory, they can put pressure on Belgium and Alsace. And so what I normally recommend as Germany is to expect to fall back into Alsace on G2. The French are then most likely to move from Lorraine to Belgium. And then it's not uncommon to have the German forces move from Alsace to the Ruhr on turn 3. And this is where I think it's important to highlight the importance of the Ruhr. This territory is 6 IPCs. In my experience, you do not want to even have this zone contested. You want to collect this 6 IPCs every turn. So as Germany makes this gradual strategic withdrawal towards the Ruhr, it behooves a German player to keep an eye on how large the French army is and make sure there's enough pieces, just enough pieces, coming into the Ruhr to create a positive value attack if the French decide to move into Alsace. If that's a little vague or doesn't make sense, just understand the bottom line up front is you do not want the French to reliably create a contested zone in the Ruhr. In my experience, it's just too economically damaging to be fighting the Battle of the Western Front in this territory. As the German player, we can afford to allow the French to move into Belgium and even Alsace, but they really cannot go any further. So even though Russia is the priority, adjust your reinforcements out of Berlin accordingly. Okay, with that said, what does the long game look like for Germany out here? Well, after Russia falls, obviously 100% of the reinforcements coming out of Berlin will be headed towards the West Front. This will almost immediately relieve pressure on the Ruhr and possibly Munich. And since Alsace is 3 spaces away from both capitals and close to the center of the board, this can become a flashpoint where both Germany, France, and possibly even the UK are throwing pieces into the meat grinder. And a few turns after Russia falls, this turns into everything you would think is stereotypical about the West Front. It's usually a meat grinder, and both sides are moving in chess-like fashion across this checkerboard of territories. Inevitably, however, one side will eventually move into Switzerland. This country, like Ukraine, borders 7 other territories, so it has an extremely high strategic influence. If a very large army can safely gain this position, what you'll generally see is most pieces from all sides gravitate towards the middle of the board. I really can't speak much more deeply than that about this territory. And that's due to the fact that there are so many variations of the board state by the time this becomes a critical aspect of the game that there's not much more to say other than what I've already said. So my intent here is just to make players, especially the German player, aware of it. So let me wrap up this segment by saying, although this front does not start out as the most important one, this area of the board becomes the most important area after the fall of Russia. And in my experience playing the Central Powers, wins usually come by concession after the Central Powers forces have overpowered this area of the board. Let's now review the German situation in Africa. This area of the board doesn't have very many pieces, but appears to be quite chaotic. There's a single German infantry in each of the following territories: Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, and Southwest Africa. There's also an artillery down here in Southwest Africa. In the immediate vicinity, the British also have an equal number of forces. There's a single infantry in Anglo-Egypt Sudan, British East Africa, Rhodesia, and Union of South Africa, with an artillery in Union of South Africa. At the peripheries, we have an Italian infantry in Somaliland, a French infantry in French West Africa, and a rather large British force up here in Egypt. Finally, relevant British naval pieces include a battleship and a transport in Sea Zone 29, which has access to units in India. So when it comes to the German strategy in Africa, I advocate for a more conservative approach. In my experience, the best thing the Germans can do down here is prolong the life of their forces. This is a tough position for the Germans, and the end is inevitable. But when played well, the German forces down here can draw away Entente forces that are needed elsewhere at the beginning of the game. I think when well played, Germany can survive until at least turn 3 and up to turn 6 before being overrun by Entente forces. So when we look through the lens of survivability, the German unit in the most precarious position is the infantry in German East Africa. Not only is there an enemy unit to the north and to the south, but the British Navy have access to this territory. So the only territory we can move to get away from certain destruction is Belgian Congo. Belgian Congo is an unaligned neutral, so when the Germans move in, we simply take it over. So now he's in a slightly better position. There are 3 infantry units adjacent, but at least naval units don't have access to him. But we're not content to sit on this 3-to-1 odds, so we're going to bring in the troop from Cameroon. So with that 2nd infantry unit added into Belgian Congo, there's now only a 26% chance that the British clear this territory if they attack with all 3 infantry pieces. With the infantry in Togoland, we're going to move into Nigeria. And finally, the 2 units in Southwest Africa will hold where they are. And the reason for not moving is because if we did move into Angola, sure, we would get the extra IPC for Germany, but we would then be exposing ourselves to 1 additional British infantry available to attack us, and 2 infantry and an artillery versus 1 infantry and an artillery. There's a 41% chance the British wipe everything out, and a 59% chance, of course, for the draw. In this position down here in Southwest Africa, the British can only attack with 1 artillery and 1 infantry, and if they did so, it would only have a 19% chance of success, a 62% chance of a draw, and a 19% chance of being totally destroyed. And that's the same odds, of course, if the Germans attacked the British. But our priority down here, at least on the first turn, is survivability. And with that goal in mind, I feel like these opening moves down here are the best for Germany. In terms of what to do on turns 2, 3, and onward, look for opportunities to do some damage, yes, but again, the goal is survivability. In my experience, many games see the Entente Navy deploy some amount of troops down here, and especially in that case, one area that can be very helpful is Rhodesia. If the Germans are able to get here, the Entente will be unable to use their battleships or transports in direct assaults against this territory. Otherwise, I do recommend trying to keep the fight as far south as possible. Again, the more Entente troops down here in the beginning of the game, the better. You want them to spend as much energy as you can make them spend to dig these pieces out. The more you're able to do this, the less pressure there will be on the Ottomans to the north, at least in the beginning of the game. And as the Central Powers, let me say that every little bit helps a lot. We'll now move to the place units phase, collect income, and end this video. Germany places 9 infantry and 1 fighter in Berlin, and with the addition of Belgium, Congo, and Nigeria, Germany will collect 39 IPCs for a total of 41. This number will be 44 if Poland was secured on the first turn. So to quickly recap what we went over, this was Germany's strategic video. I opened with what I feel is an optimal first turn purchase. I then broke up Germany's first turn into 4 segments, first reviewing my recommendations for how to handle G1 on the East Front, then moving to what I think is the best moves for the Battle of the Atlantic. Following that, we moved to the West Front, and finally we had a brief discussion about what to do in Africa. I covered mid and long-range strategies in each segment, and as I close, remember that one topic in this video remained incomplete, and that was how to kill Russia. That's because this topic deserves its own video, and that will be next in this series, so be sure to check it out. It's titled The Russian Revolution Rule. If you're interested in playing Germany or the CP in general better, I highly recommend watching that video. Thanks for watching this, all the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.